James Walker pushed open the door of Millie's diner, the little bell above it giving a cheerful ring as he stepped inside. The place hadn't changed in years. Same red booths, same smell of coffee and fried bacon, same jazz tunes humming faintly from the dusty speakers. For James, it was comforting. He was a man of routine now, and this quiet little spot was where he went to enjoy peace. He gave a polite nod to Millie, the owner, who barely looked up from the register. They had an understanding. No small talk. Just the usual. 2 eggs, over easy, black coffee, and wheat toast. Booth by the window. That's how it had been every Friday morning since he retired. Sliding into his usual seat, James glanced around. A few regulars were scattered across the diner, noses buried in newspapers or sipping their coffee in silence. But what caught his eye was the figure seated in the back corner. A young woman in uniform sat upright, visibly tense, with a large German shepherd lying beside her booth. The dog wore a military-grade vest with patches. One read, "Do not PAT." The other had a small flag. His ears perked up, alert even in rest. James recognized the look in both of them. They'd seen things. They were still in the rhythm of watching doors, checking exits, staying sharp. He quietly respected that and looked away, not wanting to intrude. The door opened again. This time, it wasn't peaceful. A tall man, mid-40s, strode in with a scowl already on his face. He glanced around once, then locked eyes on the dog. His nose wrinkled like he'd just walked into a garbage dump. "You kidding me?" he barked, loud enough to snap several heads up. "There's a dog in here. That's a health violation." The room tensed. Millie looked up. "Sir, that's a service K9. I don't care what it is. I'm not eating with a dog in the room." The woman in uniform opened her mouth to respond but didn't get the chance. The man marched forward, ignoring everyone, eyes locked on the dog like it was some kind of threat. Shadow, the dog, didn't move, just stared. James exhaled slowly, pushed his coffee aside, and stood. He didn't speak yet. He just stepped between the man and the handler, placing himself like a wall. The diner went quiet. James looked at the man calmly and said, "That dog served more than you ever will. Sit down, or walk out." The silence deepened. Something was about to shift. And it did. The man didn't back down right away. He stared at James, sizing him up, probably thinking he was just some old veteran playing tough in a small-town diner. But James had that look, the kind that didn't blink. The kind you saw in people who'd walked through fire and come out the other side quieter, but not weaker. "What? Are you his bodyguard now?" The man sneered, jerking his chin toward the K9. James didn't move. "No," he said flatly. "But I know how to deal with threats." There was a beat of silence, the kind that made your ears ring a little. The man glanced around the room, suddenly realizing that every person in the diner was now watching him. Millie had a phone in her hand under the counter. A man at the counter, probably a trucker, had stopped mid-bite and was staring like he'd just tuned in to a movie's climax. "I just want to eat," the man grumbled, backing off a step. "But I don't eat where animals sit near food." The young woman in uniform, still seated, finally spoke, calm, controlled. "He's not an animal. He's a working dog, authorized by federal law to be here." The man opened his mouth again, but James cut in, voice just above a whisper, but sharp enough to slice through steel. "And he's trained to remain calm. I'd suggest you do the same." Something in that tone settled the man's nerves, finally. He looked around again, saw no support, no allies, and let out a bitter laugh. "This whole town's gone soft," he muttered. He turned and walked out, the door slamming behind him harder than necessary. As it shut, the diner seemed to exhale. Millie slowly put the phone down. A few customers returned to their meals, murmuring under their breath. The tension was gone, but a strange quiet lingered. James sat back down at his booth without a word. He didn't look at Reyes, the handler, and she didn't look at him, at least not right away. But after a moment, she stood and walked over, Shadow trailing beside her. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was strong, but something behind her eyes looked tired, like someone who hadn't rested in a long time. James gave a small nod, eyes still on his coffee. "Some people just need reminding," he said, "what respect looks like." Shadow sat beside her, ears perked, watching the door. And outside, the man sat in his truck, engine running, but not leaving. Not yet. James took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the bitter warmth settle in his chest. The silence in the diner stretched long after the man had left, as if the air itself was waiting. His eyes drifted over to Specialist Reyes and her K9, Shadow, still seated at the corner booth. The dog, calm and still, never once moved his gaze from the door, as if instinctively aware that something wasn't quite right. Reyes shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She ran a hand over her face, tired, worn. She looked like someone who had been carrying weight far too long. Her uniform, clean but with small signs of wear, seemed to have its own stories etched into the fabric. After a moment, she finally spoke. "I didn't expect that to go like that." James met her eyes. "You didn't expect the dog to be a problem." She gave a small, humorless laugh. "No, not really. I mean, we get it. People are always people. But I didn't expect it to get that bad." Her eyes flicked toward the door, as if she expected the man to return with more trouble. James noticed the unease in her posture, the way she kept checking the reflection in the diner's window. It wasn't just from the earlier confrontation. It was something deeper. "Who was he?" James asked, his voice casual but observant. Reyes hesitated, then spoke quietly, almost to herself. "He wasn't just some angry guy who didn't like dogs. He knew what I was doing here, where I've been. And I think he's been following us." James raised an eyebrow. "You think?" "I know," she said, leaning forward slightly. "He was too specific in what he said. I didn't want to make a scene." But her voice trailed off as she glanced toward Shadow. The dog, silent and watchful, shifted slightly, sensing her tension. "I've been getting messages, threats, strange ones, and I've been trying to ignore them, but now..." She stopped herself, biting her lip. James leaned back, considering. His hand subconsciously tightened around his coffee mug, but he didn't say anything. The truth was, he had seen too many situations like this. Tensions, threats, people who didn't understand the kind of people or animals that came home from war. "You're safe for now," James said finally, his voice low. "But I'm not so sure you'll be safe for long." Reyes glanced at him, a flicker of something in her eyes. Gratitude, or was it something more? Before she could speak again, the bell above the door rang. The quiet was broken, but this time, no one looked up. Shadow's ears twitched. The door's bell rang again, breaking the stillness in the diner. A man in a dark jacket stepped inside, pausing just inside the threshold. His gaze swept over the room, then locked onto Reyes and Shadow. His expression was unreadable, but the air immediately seemed to shift. James didn't need to look up to know something was off. He could feel the change in the room. Tension, like the hairs on the back of your neck standing at attention. The new arrival wasn't just another diner customer. His posture was too purposeful, his eyes too focused. Reyes stiffened. She subtly placed her hand on Shadow's collar, a silent command that didn't need to be spoken. The dog, sensing the shift, gave a low, barely audible growl. "Everything okay?" James asked, his voice quiet, but he was already rising from his seat. "Not sure yet," Reyes replied, her eyes narrowing slightly as she watched the man carefully. "But we're about to find out." The man walked toward them, slow but deliberate, his boots making soft thuds against the diner's floor. When he reached their table, he stopped. His eyes flicked to Shadow, then back to Reyes. His face was unreadable, but there was a hardness there that didn't sit right. "Specialist Reyes?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Reyes didn't answer right away. Instead, she studied the man's face, trying to place him, trying to figure out what he was doing here. James noticed the slight tension in her shoulders, the way she instinctively reached for the edge of the table to steady herself. She didn't like this, whatever it was. The man's eyes briefly flicked toward James, then back to Reyes. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. James's instincts were kicking in now. Something was happening, and he wasn't about to let it pass without getting involved. "And you are?" he asked, his voice colder than before, cutting through the stillness. The man's gaze hardened. "I'm someone who can make sure things go the way they need to," he replied cryptically. Reyes took a deep breath, then slowly stood up. "I know you're not here for a chat, but if you're with them, I'm not going anywhere without backup." James saw the shift in her demeanor, a quiet decision, one that told him she knew exactly what was happening now. And just like that, the peaceful diner wasn't so peaceful anymore. The man didn't flinch at Reyes's response. He simply stood there, his gaze unwavering. But James noticed a subtle shift in his stance, like a soldier preparing for a fight. The words left the man's lips without emotion, almost like a warning. "It's better if you're not here for this." James took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "I don't think I like the way you're speaking to her," he said, his tone colder now, sharper. Reyes put her hand on his arm, a subtle but firm gesture to hold him back. "James," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper, but with the weight of a command. "It's okay." James didn't move. He wasn't so sure it was okay, but Reyes's calm demeanor made him hesitate. The man turned slightly, glancing toward the door as another black SUV pulled into the parking lot. This wasn't the typical military presence. There was something off about it. The way the vehicles moved in, the precision with which each one came to a stop. It was too coordinated, too deliberate. Two more SUVs followed the first, the engines rumbling low in the early evening quiet. A third vehicle, smaller but no less sleek, came to a stop in front of the diner. From the shadows inside, a few figures in tactical gear began to step out, their movements smooth and purposeful. Reyes's eyes locked onto them immediately. She didn't flinch, but James saw the flicker of recognition in her gaze. The man from earlier, the one who had walked in with such calculated calm, stepped aside to give the newcomer space, his body language shifting from authority to a sort of reverence. "This isn't good," Reyes muttered under her breath. James turned to her, his eyes searching hers for some explanation. But she was already standing, every muscle in her body coiled tight with readiness. Shadow, ever loyal, shifted beside her, his ears alert, his body tense. "Who are they?" James asked, his voice tight with suspicion. Reyes didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at the group outside, then at James. The silence between them hung thick in the air. "They're not with me," she finally said, the words almost too quiet. "They're here to take Shadow. And me." Before James could react, one of the figures outside glanced toward the diner, locking eyes with Reyes. He was tall, his face obscured by a balaclava and dark sunglasses, but the recognition was immediate. The leader. In a smooth, almost imperceptible motion, Reyes reached for the small device strapped to her side. And just like that, everything began to change. The moment the figures outside made eye contact with Reyes, the tension in the diner became palpable. James's instincts flared. This wasn't just some routine operation. This wasn't about a simple dog or a soldier eating breakfast. It was bigger than that. Much bigger. Reyes didn't look at him, but James could feel her calculating every second, every possible move. Her hand, still resting on the collar of Shadow, twitched slightly. She wasn't just preparing for the worst. She was already in it. The leader of the group outside didn't make any aggressive moves. Instead, he simply nodded. A subtle gesture, but it was enough to signal the others. Slowly, almost silently, they began to advance toward the diner. James felt his pulse quicken. "Reyes," he said quietly, voice low. "What's going on?" Her eyes never left the window. She took a deep breath before she turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "They're military. But not the way you think. Not the kind you know." James raised an eyebrow. "Then what are they?" Reyes hesitated, her eyes darkening. "They're part of a Black Ops team. High level, no questions asked. And they've been tracking me. And Shadow. For a while now." "What do they want with you?" James asked, his mind racing. He thought of every mission he'd ever been on, every piece of intel he'd gathered. He'd never heard of anything like this. Reyes closed her eyes briefly, as if trying to steady herself. "It's classified. But it's not just about me. Shadow found something. A signal, a trace, something encrypted. It led to something dangerous. And they want to clean it up." James could hear the unspoken words between them. This wasn't just a cleanup job. Whatever Shadow had found, it was worth covering up. Worth going to extreme lengths for. "They're not here for a dog," Reyes said softly, her voice tight. "They're here to make sure I don't tell anyone what happened, what Shadow found." James stood straighter, his mind already calculating his next move. He'd been in situations like this before, dangerous ones, where every second counted. But this felt different. He wasn't part of the team. He wasn't supposed to be involved. "Then we need to get out of here," James said, his voice low but firm. Reyes's eyes met his for the first time. She nodded. "Not without Shadow. And not without making sure they don't get to us." Outside, the first man in tactical gear stepped forward, his hand resting on his weapon. He was closing in. And James knew that the diner, this quiet little spot, was about to become the last place anyone would want to be. The man in tactical gear stepped closer to the door, his hand resting lightly on the grip of his rifle. His movements were smooth, almost rehearsed. He knew exactly what he was doing. Behind him, the others followed, quiet, methodical, moving like a well-practiced team. James didn't wait for them to reach the door. He had seen enough. Without looking at Reyes, he crossed the diner floor with deliberate calm. There was no panic, no hesitation, just the cold certainty that things were about to escalate. Reyes's voice broke through the tension. "James, stop. We don't have time to." But James was already at the door, his hand on the handle, eyes scanning the men outside. He wasn't about to let them come inside without a plan. "Stay low," he said over his shoulder, his voice steady. "I'll handle this." Reyes moved quickly, glancing at Shadow before she followed his lead, sliding low behind the counter to take cover. James opened the door just a crack, enough to see the leader of the team. The man's face was obscured by the balaclava and dark sunglasses, but there was something in his posture, something familiar. A recognition flickered in James's mind, but it wasn't immediate. "Step away from the door," the man commanded, his voice low but forceful. James ignored him, letting the door swing open slowly. "You don't want to do this," he said, his tone firm, giving nothing away. The man took a step closer, his eyes narrowing behind the sunglasses. "This doesn't concern you, Walker. Get back inside." The name hit James like a punch to the gut. Walker. He hadn't heard that name in years, at least not from anyone who wasn't close to him. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of a long-forgotten past. The voice, the way the man moved, it was someone from his old life, someone he thought was lost to him. "Don't recognize me, huh?" the man said with a dry laugh, stepping closer, his voice taking on an almost mocking tone. "I'd hoped you'd forgotten." James's heart skipped a beat. He knew that voice, but it was the tone that struck him, the familiarity, the bitterness that came with it. It was someone from his past, someone who had been part of the same operations, the same dark world he had left behind. "You?" James muttered, his voice a mix of disbelief and anger. You're still with them." The man's lips curled into a smirk, but there was no warmth in it. "Some of us never really leave, Walker. And you know it." The world outside seemed to hold its breath. James stood there, the weight of recognition sinking in. His pulse quickened, and his mind flashed back to a time he had long buried. A time when this man, the one standing before him, had been a part of the same team, the same mission. A different time, a different life. The man's smirk grew wider, a cruel edge to his expression. "I knew you wouldn't stay away forever, Walker. I knew you'd come back when things got hot." James narrowed his eyes, pushing the past away. He had to stay focused. This wasn't about nostalgia. This was about survival. He wasn't the man he used to be, and he wasn't going to let anyone drag him back to that life. "You're with the government." "Still," James said, his voice flat. "Why come after her? After Shadow?" The man's face twisted, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he took another step forward, his hand never leaving the rifle. His team behind him moved in tandem, surrounding the diner with calculated precision. "You don't get it, do you, Walker?" the man said, his voice dropping to a lower, more dangerous tone. "This isn't about her or the dog. It's about the information. The intel that got out. You know how this works. She's a liability now." James's eyes flicked to Reyes behind the counter. She was ready, eyes sharp, her hand still resting on Shadow's collar. The dog was on edge, but he wasn't moving. Not yet. Reyes's voice was steady as she spoke from her hiding place. "You're wrong. Shadow didn't leak anything. We found something. Something bigger than you understand. If it gets in the wrong hands, it'll be a problem for all of us." The man's eyes flashed with anger, his grip tightening on his weapon. "You don't know who you're dealing with, Specialist. This is bigger than your little K9 operation. If you don't hand over the information, things are going to get ugly." The quiet between them seemed to stretch, every second carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken threats. James stood his ground. He had no intention of letting this man, or his team, take Reyes or Shadow. Not after everything he had fought for. Not after all the people he had lost. "I don't think you get it," James said quietly, his voice low but intense. "You won't be walking out of here with anything." A cold silence followed. The team outside knew better than to make a move. Then, in the distance, a loud sound broke the standoff. Sirens. The unmistakable sound of approaching law enforcement. Someone had called for backup. And just like that, the man's posture stiffened. The game had changed. James didn't smile. He just nodded toward the door. The past had caught up with him, but this time, he was ready.